All right. So our first item on the agenda is following up on past action items, and we have 3 of those. We have Dimitri to propose a patch to reference that makes the recommendation for downstream packagers to use the version name rather than code name. The patch is up from what I have seen, so please comment on that. The second item is Dimitri again to write the words for the Smith plan. So to holding off on removing Python 3.8 support. I did see an email going out for that, but I haven't seen the proposal yet.
Yeah, I started working on it, but haven't finished looking through, other docs and where it can be and should be mentioned, because we have information quite not spread, but mentioned in multiple places. So want to cover everything. So it's in progress.
Okay, thanks for the update. I will mark this as an action item again so that we have a reference to circle back for next week as well.
Yeah, just one thing, we have to do it as soon as possible, I think, because we have dropped the Python 3.8 unit testing job from general template, which means from all the projects. So as we agreed to include Python 3.8 now, so till Dimitri have the proposal up and we merge that, should we just go ahead and add the P38 job in unit test template? That will not harm anything. If we change the decision, obviously we can remove it anytime, right? I'm just thinking having a job will make sure there is no compatible changes introduced for any project.
You will break any of the repos that have already dropped support, but that's probably a good thing in this case.
Yeah, that also we have to get them reverted, but obviously they can wait for the governance patch. But as long as we should bring the testing in as soon as possible. So
I guess we can make it non-voting for now, as it doesn't quite yet align with our policy. And then once we have the proposal merged, we can switch it to voting so that it aligns with our policy.
It's not as per our policy. Any extended testing is always in our policy. So our minimum expectation is P39 and 310 as per testing requirement. We can always make 3.8 as voting also, right? So that still within our policies. Right.
I'm just saying that for now, 3.8 is not in our PTI. So to have a job that gates on 3.8 seems to misalign with what we are communicating.
No, so this is something I strongly disagree with. And I think that this is the source of a lot of the confusion and trouble that's happened the last week and a half. The PTI is saying you have to do 3.9 and 3.10.
Yes.
It doesn't say anything about 3.8, right?
Yeah.
So a really good example here is Swift still has 2.7 support, and they've had it forever, right? And that isn't in conflict with the PTI, even though the PTI hasn't had 2.7 support since Train or something, right? It's long gone for.
Yeah, but we don't have 2.7 tests for everybody.
Correct.
Yeah. No.
But the point I'm making is that you are allowed to have 2.7. No one is saying you can't have that. What we are saying is that you must have 3.9 and 3.10.
Exactly.
Right. And so it's a misreading, in my opinion, of the PTI to say that because only 3.9 and 3.10 are required, that everything else is disallowed. Right. And I think that's where this conflict is coming from.
We're not saying that they're disallowed, right? What we're saying is, until we explain that we want to enforce that it's not just allowed but encouraged, Christy was saying we should make this job non-voting. Right, so we want a job up there to test 3.8 so we can see where the breakages are. But it seems kind of overkill to make it voting at this point when the governance document just says 3.9 and 3.10. Right, so individual projects could be doing 3.8 already, and that's perfectly fine. But
I think
as a general-
the-
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, yeah, but I mean, the problem is the co-installability thing, right? Like people, just shoving it into the template and making it voting surprises a few people that have already specifically broken 3.8, right? But it also is in support of the fact that those projects have already broken everyone else that doesn't want to explicit or doesn't and hasn't explicitly. I mean, you like everybody has already been broken already. So like it's a subset of people to break those few that have put that block in kind of in the same way. I guess I feel like if we're putting it in the template, then it's reasonable, I guess, to put it in the template non-voting for a week and say, at the end of this week, we're going to, because the longer we leave that not voting, the further people can drift into breaking co-installability, right? So it's like, we've already reverted the upper constraints so that people can't install those versions. So everybody that's dependent on those people should be not broken. And then like, you know, we can give a short window, but the longer the window, the more likely we are to have things creep in that are harder to revert. Right?
Yes, Dimitri?
Yeah, that's right. But I wanted to make a remark in terms of that. I mean, our PTI is mistreated. So when I started adjusting document in one place, it was said that, well, Python version may change from cycle to cycle, and projects should target the following: replacing previous Python jobs with what is defined in PTI. So we were instructed to replace basically all jobs and all Python versions with what is written in PTI. So it's not all like only like project faults that they mistreated, but we gave wrong instructions, I believe.
But that's not really the same thing. I mean, I guess the concern is over the use of the word replace, right? But it's also talking about jobs and not like, you know, your requires in your setup config. So I think that still leads to Clark's point that, you know, saying that you need to replace your jobs to get the new version of Python tested is also not really
Yeah,
saying.
I mean, but it's easy to get confused, you know.
It's
not like
poor language. I'll give
Yeah.
you that for sure.
Exactly, and we can explicitly tell that config thing required version or required Python, whatever, like not to be like very strict on that. Even if we don't have that, that will be a good thing, right?
But this is like, it's you risk having the opposite problem if you aren't accurate in your required Python version settings, where you can pip install something on an older version of Python and it installs perfectly fine, and then you go to execute the command and it crashes, and you're like, what the heck?
Yeah, so that's, we have the specific like classifier there, right? Saying Python 3.9, 10 is supported, but we don't block it to install on 3.8. If it works fine, if it doesn't, then it's
but
okay.
pip doesn't respect that, right? And that's particularly important for libraries because it's transitive dependencies. You're not actively thinking about what versions of these 10 deep transitive dependencies you're working with. It's like, sure, I'm going to install this version of Nova, pip install Nova, and it all works. But then you go to run it and Nova crashes because some library 10 layers deep doesn't support that version of Python. The way you solve that in the Python package ecosystem is with requires Python. And so I think that value still needs to be accurate, but there needs to be like a more coordinated modification of the value.
I understand what you're saying, but I also disagree with that because I think that it's too big of a hammer. Like it's and part of it is because it gets used too much, I think, to like bump out unsupported versions of Python that we would still run on And I just think that's too big of a hammer. But if we're going to be accurate about that and have that in there, then we kind of have to have full test coverage on it, right?
Yeah, and one point in that is that's why like our PTIs will conflict here. If in PTI we are saying like not drop or replace, then we cannot say, right, required Python has to be bumped up, right? If anyone like say Oslo is doing Python required Python greater than 3.8, it means they are interpreting our PTI to drop the Python 3.8. But there we are saying, okay, it's not dropping, you can still test. So I'm saying both things has to be matched. Either we strongly encourage every project to drop the things, which makes like require Python also to bump up, or just have this PTI considered as a minimum testing and keep as much as possible support you can do for 3.8, 3.6, and not make it uninstallable. Okay.
Yes, Jeremy?
Yeah, so what we discussed in the TC channel last week, which I still think holds, is that we just need a coordinated way of adjusting that. And probably the simplest way is when we see that we're going to drop a supported version of the CPython interpreter from the PTI, we need to schedule a cutoff date that we say, as of this date, projects should drop all of their jobs for this version of Python, except for this specific Canary job that we're using to make sure that everything is still supported. And then on that date, we drop that job as well, probably via a project template. And at that time, it is then considered safe for projects to start adding requires Python greater than equal to whatever the new minimum version is. We can't really easily make judgment calls about when libraries are safe to do it versus when services are safe to do it, because we've got projects like Neutron that are being imported as libraries into other projects. And so if Neutron does it early because it's not a library, then it's still going to break Nova and so on. So I think if we make specific dates for these transitions and we bake them into the release schedule, then we can mostly mitigate this pain. A lot of what happened this time around is that we had some Oslo libraries that decided in the first couple of weeks of the cycle that they were going to drop support for versions of Python that weren't covered in the PTI, and then set a breaks in their metadata for anything older than that. And that obviously had a ripple effect, whereas in prior cycles, the libraries tended to wait till the end, and we mostly avoided that problem. But I think that on the whole, we really need to have two phases, where the first is get everybody working through dropping the jobs on the old versions of Python. And then after that cutoff date, we say it's safe for projects who want to set a minimum Python version to then do that.
The thing that gets tough in is if you don't delineate between libraries and endpoints, kind of like you're saying. I know Neutron makes it hard, but I'm actually thinking of the reverse of the Neutron case, where we might have a library like Sushi, for instance, which we want to keep supporting on other Python versions. Having a cutoff date like that presented, we'll have to be very careful about the way it's said to make sure that OpenStack libraries that are consumed by organizations outside of OpenStack can continue to support more if they want to. And maybe even to the point, like with some of the stuff like an Oslo library, I almost feel like we should encourage that level of leniency, sort of like Dan alluded to, of like a best effort. If you've tested your product against this library, then it's probably safe to use. Because I would hate to see, for instance, us in Ironic have to drop support for Python version X on Sushi, when maybe we have another customer who's using it outside of the OpenStack ecosystem to access their Redfish devices. And we want to support Python 3.8, maybe Oslo config or whatever. I don't know the specific libraries of that. We may not even use any OpenStack libraries. It's a straw man. If Oslo config could support 3.8, but by policy dropped their minimum Python version, or by misinterpretation of policy dropped that Python version, it's going to have negative impacts rippling through the ecosystem. So like there's sort of two categories of things here I see. There's like the endpoints that are in the OpenStack integrated release. Those having like a tighter realm on what they say and requires Python makes a lot of sense, that we don't have someone installing, I don't want someone trying to run Ironic on some unsupported version and breaking their machine, right? But on the same side, we have a huge number of libraries that are used inside and outside of the OpenStack ecosystem. And I kind of think, the opposite happened of what should have happened when Oslo pulled support for those libraries early. Those libraries should be the last thing to drop Python support for something. And I don't think we express that very well in policy today. But at some point, I feel like we've got to make a delineation, even if it's hard, between things that are libraries and things that are libraries and things that are like in goal services running.
We do have deadline differences for libraries and projects, right?
Yeah, for releases.
Right.
Because we expect the library releases to come out before, so that the integration testing and everything can happen.
Right.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying, Jay, is I think that's kind of what I was trying to get at. Like the PTI is there to say like OpenStack is going to run on Python 3.9 and 3.10, but it's not to say that you can't have a library that is used more broadly that supports more versions of Python, or even a service like say Swift that just because their users need it or want it continues to go beyond that. The other thing I wanted to say with what Jeremy was talking about is I think the other missing piece here is we've optimized the integration testing to the point where we actually have a lot less tight coupling in the CI system, which in one way is good. It allows projects to be more independent and kind of progress when others are stuck. But at the same time, it allows these issues to get through. If we had stronger integration testing, Oslo wouldn't, whatever Oslo library would not have been able to merge a change that broke Python 3.8, right? Because we were still dependent on Python 3.8 in the system. If we actually had integration testing that reflected that, and Oslo was a part of that, it would have failed, and people would have gone, oh, we need to figure out how to get off of 3.8 before we can drop support here, type of thing.
Well, it dropped its 3.8 jobs when it dropped 3.8 support.
Right, but if OpenStack said Oslo is going to run this integration job under Python 3.8 in a central, like
and that's
5 years ago,
that's the canary job that I was saying we needed to retain at least until whatever date we decided was safe for libraries to start dropping support for that. And we can even say that that date is not within the cycle where we're dropping that version of Python. It might be in the next cycle that we don't allow libraries to actually drop support for versions of Python we've removed from the API or from the PTI until the following cycle, because we know by then that our service projects should have stopped running jobs on those versions. But
would it not be reasonable to say that, I mean, if we can agree on what a library is, to say that the libraries that we release should not have a requires Python greater than what the current upstream supported Python versions are?
That seems reasonable to me, as long as we can maintain testing for it. I mean, in this particular case, the first one to hit us this cycle was 2s. And while it's technically an Oslo library, it's not only used by OpenStack projects. And so they very aggressively dropped support for versions of Python that weren't in the OpenStack PTI, even though there are people throughout the Python ecosystem utilizing that library who aren't using them for OpenStack projects, and so almost certainly have an interest in using it with older versions of the CPython interpreter.
I mean, to be honest, that's too aggressive for my taste as well, because even though upstream Python might not be supported, there are LTS distros that have technically, as far as the users are concerned, supported versions of Python. But at least it seems like a reasonable bar to drag that further out, so that we don't have people bumping libraries to, what is actually a really new version of Python as a requirement.
And I don't think there's much, like from a technical standpoint, like you say, because the LTSs exist and they lag even further, we can test on those LTSs which lag. And so I don't know that having the ability to test an older Python like that is a concern. Python is more aggressively end-of-lifing Python versions than, say, Ubuntu and CentOS Red Hat.
Yeah, but I mean, we can stick really to LTSs because if you take Ubuntu, they have extended maintenance with paid support, which like come down to 1804, I believe, right now, or 1404 or something like that. We will never be able to kind of.
Yes,
Wait,
Jim?
I'm not.
And
I don't think anyone is saying we have to use like paid support versions for LTS things, right? It's just more just saying that like having an old version of Python older than what Python end of lifed is not difficult.
So, that is why like how we are in hurry to bump the Python version, like we always try to move our distro version, and whatever default there, we try to move our Python version also. So there are two problems. I think one is obviously the coordinated effort, which Fungi mentioned, we should do it in future, but more of that problem here is, can we stick it to the as oldest Python version and the distro version as much as we can? Like, for example, now Jemmy and 3.8, or say Debian 11, we will not move Python 3.8 as minimum version until like there is a hard dependency break. Either our external dependencies are breaking on 3.8 or 3.8 is end of life. So that is something like we have to make sure, like anytime we are bumping the Python version, minimum version, we have to think, is there a way for us to test and support that or not? Otherwise, like having Python 3.8 for next 2 years is all good, right? If everything is fine.
Well, I guess you mean if there's no LTS version that has Python 3.7, then it's difficult for us to say Python 3.7 is the minimum, right?
Yeah, say for example, I think 3.8 focal, Ubuntu focal at 3.8 something, right? So I'm saying like keep supporting the focal until we have hard break for Python 3.8 due to our external dependencies or something.
But do you mean focal for DevStack jobs or just focal for unit and functional testing?
Just I mean unit and functional DevStack job, if we have that is all good, right?
The
best
reason
effort we can say.
Yeah, the reason is that the Nova team, not me, but some people on the Nova team want to more aggressively bump the minimum version of libvirt and QEMU, and focal is a thing holding us back there, which I'm not sure how I feel about. But
so I understand. I think in that case also still fine, but let's not bump the Python version for such cases, like until we can say, okay, focal you are best supported, or even not in our PTI, but still Python 3.8, and there is a way to install is like via focal. So we'll test Python 3.8 unit or functional test, so as long as we can do.
So it seems we have full agreement on keeping 3.8. This was reiterated as well in the previous TC meeting. So we should add 3.8 to the PTI. We should add a 3.8 job, and we should communicate to the projects to restore 3.8 support if they haven't yet. The other questions that I'm hearing here is, when do we drop support for a Python version, and how do we balance being too aggressive and being too conservative, either infringing on the project's independence to want to use features that would make their job easier, but also not break other projects that depend on them. And this is a question that I don't feel like we have an answer yet. Like, yes, we can tie things to focal for now and keep 3.8 until focal is not really supported, but it's still hard to balance this.
So that's the minimum version they need to test, right? So we don't stop them to continue testing 3.10, 11, or say 12 or any other latest thing.
Sure, but we cannot mandate a project support indefinitely a version of Python because they have one project that depends them who refuses to like update, and that's something we as the TC should intermediate.
So the one solution on that was like how we do the distro version up, like with a community-wide goal. So we have to make sure any Python version, minimum version we are changing. So that has to be done with the community-wide goal. And that includes a coordinated effort of bumping that required Python version in all the project in OpenStack?
Sure. Yes, Jay?
So I want to address kind of two things, and I think they're sort of interrelated. First of all, I think it's a little bit inaccurate to say that people can't, like get the features of a newer Python if they also have to support an older one. There's lots of tools and patterns in Python for if I'm the old version, do the old way. If I'm the new version, do the new way. That's obviously not free, but in that sort of vein, like I sort of like to think of like what knobs we as the TC have to turn, right? Like we can set guidelines, but we can't necessarily tell someone to go maintain something. We don't have that level of control over folks' time. So when I think about that problem of libraries that might have customers that want to continue using them on smaller versions, my thought was less a mandate that we say they support those versions, because that's going to be tough, because we're just taking people who have limited time and adding to their burden without really giving anything back to them. More, I was thinking, have a process like Clark was laying out where we can say, like this project says they're going to drop support for Python 3.8 as their objections, and waiting and giving folks a opportunity to volunteer and say, hey, well, the Ironic team or the Cinder team or whatever is invested in continuing to keep this supporting 3.8. What are your technical problems? Can we help you resolve them? Right? I want us to be really careful about, like, when we set a guideline that's going to cause a project team that's already potentially understaffed, that we might have had to beg someone to be the leader of last cycle to take on more effort, that maybe instead our approach should be one of, deprecation with significant notification to give folks the chance to come collaborate, make it work on the newer version, and keep going.
But to be clear, we're there, like the features of what?
You're not
There was
respecting the hand-raising action.
there was a hand raised from Brian.
Oh, sorry.
So what I'm kind of losing I should lower my hand. I'm kind of losing what we're going after here, right? So with libraries, you make a release and you say, this is the last release that supports Python 3.8. And then we go on to develop whatever the heck we want. And then if you want to use Python 3.8, then you have to use the version of the library that supports it. So I see the problem that happened with twos as people not being ready, right? It got raised in upper constraints before everybody was ready to consume Python 3.8 or greater than Python 3.8, right? I mean, libraries seem to have fixed this problem. You do the release, and then if you want to use an older version, you use the older version, right? So,
but
yeah,
we dropped the job from the requirements repository as well, which tested that things still worked with 3.8 at the same time, or actually slightly before the libraries all decided to start dropping it. And so part of the whole plan with coordinating that transition would be to drop that test in OpenStack requirements at the end of the cycle, not at the beginning of the cycle.
But even still, I mean, you can kind of get away with that with libraries because of the releases, although it kind of creates a fractured point, right? Where if twos does that and we just never bump them in their in upper constraints, then what does it mean? Like the coordinated release at the end of the cycle no longer includes all the work that twos did in that cycle, and kind of increases the distance it takes to like consume them again.
Well, there's a requirements change hanging out there that says bump the version of twos in the constraints file that never ends up merging and is
right.
-1 in tests. And hopefully that's visible to at least the requirements reviewers, but probably also the Oslo reviewers. They can go in and amend that change to split it between Python versions and say, okay, the new release only applies to Python versions 3.0 and later, and we pin to an older twos version for older versions of Python in the constraints file for as long as we're carrying those. As long as we have that test in the requirements repository that makes sure that the constraints file is co-installable for 3.8, then that situation is averted.
But that kind of changes the testing that you get. I mean, like, I know that that's technically possible, but like then you might not realize that Nova starts actually requiring that version of twos, because none of the Nova DevStack jobs or functional jobs don't even use that for the library directly. And so then you create this thing where you don't realize that what you just added doesn't actually work, right?
Because you're not going to test
Right.
Nova's functional jobs on the new version of Python that's required by the PTI.
No. You're not going to test Nova on the old version that you're pinning the version to. So you've raised upper constraints in Nova for Python 3.10. Nova's merging things, but doesn't realize that even though it says it should work on the old version of twos, it doesn't anymore.
Which, if Nova's dropping its 3.8 test jobs during that cycle anyway, that's fine. The point is to make sure that there is still a version of twos that's installable and constraints for the projects that are in progress of migrating from 3.8 to later versions, so that they don't break.
I think
exacerbates-
the simple solution here is to keep the minimum version in library as much as possible.
That's the thing.
Clark,
It's like the lower
wait.
constraints problem.
Yeah, lower
is my point.
constraint. Yeah. So
Clark
let's
has
do
had
this way here.
Clark
let's
has had
limit-
their hand raised for a while, so I would like to jump
Yeah.
to Clark, please.
I just wanted to mention really quickly that in theory, what Brian says is the way that things should work, but Python packaging doesn't always work that way because of like older things that don't understand the newer stuff to solve these problems. So there are really big exceptions, like PBR, for example. You cannot remove old Python support from PBR and then expect anything to work anymore, which is very unfortunate. And that's because it's a setup requires, and you need a very, very new setup tools that has a new pip to like figure it all out if you setup requires Python. And there may be other examples of this too. I get worried when, we're all concerned about like, let's make a single policy for all this. And I feel like ultimately a lot of this is going to come down to probably making judgment calls and doing what is appropriate for a specific piece of software. Using kind of the broader policy as like a guideline. I just worry that like if we make an assertion, well, we'll just use the constraints to keep it on the right version for 3.8. A week from now, someone's going to make a release to PBR that drops support for 2.7, 3.3, etc. And then we're going to get a whole bunch of people complaining that like they can't install their Python packages anymore. So it's something to be careful about in the situation that you're dealing with for that particular piece of software.
Yeah, like along those lines, I kind of agree with you, Clark, that it seems like the actions that we could take to at least prevent this from being a long-term thing without writing an entire book on a testing infrastructure is make it explicit that the PTI is not exclusive. The PTI is a minimum bar. You can support things newer than that. You can support things older than that, whatever. Make that clear. And then also institute some type of policy related to that says that if you are in a packet, if you are a service that is usable and installable as a library, before you drop testing for a Python version or change your Python requires, there needs to be a deprecation period where others in the community are given an opportunity to step up to maintain that support. I think if we have those catches in there, as well as the processes that have already been described by Clark to ensure that when that Python requires drops that everyone's ready for it, then I sort of think we've covered the case that is here without necessarily asking a product team to take on more work other than being willing to wait, and without necessarily requiring us to figure out how to write the one ultimate document that describes everything in perfect detail. We just need to have that waiting period in there so that folks know what's going on, have a chance to react to it and say, wait, no, I need that, or I'm willing to take that work, or something other than just waking up one day and our jobs are broken because twos was upgraded.
That to me sounds like more work than just keeping a Python 3.8 job in the template to make sure that people don't break stuff.
So let's do this thing. We are like almost more than half of the meeting to discussing this. So let Dimitri propose those policy change and guidelines, and we can put our recommend like what all things we require there to keep the minimum version as much as possible or whatever. And for now, let me propose the revert to those Oslo and other library who has done the Python 3.8, who has bumped the 3.8. And I'll propose a template change to add the Python 3.8 job as voting with depends on to those rewards, so that we don't break them, but we will try to add Python 3.8 as voting as soon as possible.
Makes sense.
Yeah, because I feel like the ordinance change and like a lot of great suggestion here about policies and all that may take time, but let's put 3.8 testing back.
But to be clear, you're going to put it back in non-voting with a warning for some period of time and then flip it, or?
No, I'm saying I'm going to revert those changes which has done the Python, who has bumped the Python 3.8 in Oslo and any other project. Then on top of that, I'll make 3.8 job as a voting.
Oh, okay. Depends on all of those things.
Depends on all those, and we'll try to merge them like as soon as possible we can.
How does this solve the root problem? Like, this just sounds like we kick this problem down a cycle. Like, I don't
He's not
understand
saying it
how
solves it.
the class of problem and not just this instance.
We have an acute problem right now, and he's trying to solve the acute
Yeah.
problem right now before it gets worse, without keeping that window large until we decide all of the shit that we just discussed for the last 30 minutes. That's
Yeah. And
I actually sort of rethinking something I said earlier. I think that letter, the email that Ghanshyam sent to the mailing list is sufficient warning. So I'm thinking, let's reverse it. Let's go ahead, do what you had proposed originally, make 3.8 voting, and then make your other patches. Can they depend on that?
it will break many
yeah.
gate and all.
All right.
So
but I'm thinking,
I think it's at Oslo, most of the Oslo libraries. So we'll try to catch up Oslo course as soon as they can merge the revert. And we have like TC agreement from the last TC meeting also, like we wanted not to drop Python 3.8, right?
That's a lot of work, and I'm appreciative of G-Man being willing to do all of that work. So I guess I would think let's take advantage of his ridiculous generosity to try that, and then if maybe next week, if we haven't seen a lot of progress on merging those things, then maybe we go with the all right, it's going to be voting in the template, and that'll help make people want to merge the patches.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, G-Man. I wrote the action on the TC channel. So we're going to circle back on this next week, hopefully with some progress. The next thing on the agenda, and thanks for these productive discussions, because there were so many things that I hadn't really considered about Python packaging that it's a whole can of worms. The next item on the agenda is gate health check. So as per always,
I've been
Yeah,
doing
yes. Go on.
I was just gonna say I've been doing some work in this area also related to the 3.8 issues to improve things and to reduce our actual hard dependency on focal. And I still probably have a couple of days of massaging things until they're all correct. But last Thursday I was not believing that we would ever be able to drop focal, and now I believe that it can happen. So that's progress. It related to the fact that all of our Ceph jobs required focal, and it seemed to be like running them on Jammy was like 100 different failures that I was not confident we were ever going to resolve.
oh, good work. Anything else, Dimitri?
Well, there was issue with mirrors for CentOS 9, but it's solved now. But yeah, decided that it's probably worth mentioning.
Anything else on the topic? The next topic on the agenda is 2023.2 leaderless projects. And Slavek is not here. he has an action in the Etherpad that he was gonna propose the retirement of Monaska. There's also Vitrage, which I know there was some consideration on Dimitri's side.
Yeah, I'm still.
Yeah, so I
waiting for him.
I have actually update from Alaska. So today was reached by users who utilized Monaska internally, and they had decision, or well, they had internal decision that they wanna maintain the project.
Nice.
So I propose them to reach out to propose a Gerrit patch for governance to mark themselves and reply to mailing thread. They said that yeah, we will do this today. Right now, like a busy, but till end of the day we will do this. But yeah, I don't know. We'll keep in touch with them, and yeah, we'll see. So let's maybe not rush too much with Monaska and give, I don't know, a couple more days for them.
Sure.
Regarding Vitrage, yeah, I mean, I don't know.
No.
I mean, I'm quite interested, but it's about like picking the battles. I think
Yeah.
if I will get to it, it always can be returned back. So
Or other way around is like it's not like huge amount of work for Vitras.
yeah,
You wanted to
so
keep for this cycle and just make sure gate is okay and release is done.
yeah,
Maybe next
so
cycle.
for sure I can pick up checking the gate status and approve releasing this part. I can get as well as like removing some patches. I'm not sure if there will be a lot of them, but yeah, no active
Yeah.
development for sure.
I'm just saying, like, give this cycle also a window if anyone get interested, and if you think like a lot of work,
Yeah.
then obviously next cycle we can decide if that
Yeah.
is okay for other TC member too.
Yeah, thanks for the work, Dimitri, and thanks for thinking it long and hard. It's hard. Cool. And for Windstackers, we're gonna be circling back, I guess, during the forum /summit/PTG. So that's
One
all
thing
for
on that. Just one thing I'm asking in release channel, but Fungi, do you know like what was the recommendation from release team for TC to deprecate retire projects? Was it M2 milestone 1 or milestone 2? They wanted the final list.
By milestone 1.
1. Okay, so which is I think this or next week.
Yeah, it's coming up. On a related note, I did include mention of the 3 teams that we're looking for leaders in this week's foundation mailing list, a foundation newsletter as well.
Newsletter, yeah, that's right. Thanks. And I think in release team we can take an exception for the Windstacker because that's something we are going to hold or say take decision by June event. So I can check with the release team to have this exception for this Windstacker getting retired after the milestone 1, if that is okay for them.
cool. And we have the new patch up for the Sahara PTL, which has the correct number of votes. It's just missing 2 days for it to be mergeable. So we are good on that front as well. Anything else on leaderless projects? Right, moving on. The next topic is broken docs due to inconsistent release naming. This was on me to update my patch to add redirects. I have not had the time last week or in the first few days of this week to work on that. So my apologies. I will try to pick up the rest of the work today and push another update to the patch that fixes the links for docs. And I don't have anything else on this topic as of now.
I mean, I kind of read comments to recommendations for distro maintainers, and I kind of start thinking, are we doing right that we are like keeping this double naming at all? Because I mean, we are inconsistent. A lot of community and TC members think that it's better to have just human names rather than numeric ones. So we are like creating more job for ourselves at the moment, and nobody really wants this, or at least I have such opinion.
Yeah, I like code names. I still have phone memories of OpenStack train and the Denver PTG with the train keeping us awake. So,
Yeah, I
you
mean,
don't,
maybe
you don't
the
have to
same, I also
convince
kind
you
of-
don't have to convince me. It's just hard to go back after we have switched the direction and just cause more confusion. So I think, especially now that we have Slurp, there is value from the like
Yep.
year and the dot count of the year releases, because it makes really easy and to understand what is a slurp and what is not a slurp.
I also really, you know, if I'm still alive in 2-3 years, will also really appreciate the use of the numbers when we're talking about when we're dropping support for things and how old they are and whatever. It makes a really pretty big difference, I think. I mean, it already has started to make some of that stuff easier, but yeah.
Yeah, obviously,
Okay,
like first
maybe
first
then we
cycle.
just
First cycle, actually, I was expecting a little more confusion than this, but just a dog thing, if we fix, I think we are more consistent on numbering, right? And obviously it will take 1 to maybe 3 cycle for even our users or outside of community also, they get used to the number more than name, right?
So
It's
there's
just a transition.
also the
it seems that we
confusion.
are inconsistent between usage of names and numbers.
Yeah.
So, for example, like distros are going to keep using names, so we are going to keep using numbers, and I believe that for example, in summits, users will keep using names as well. So, kind of numbers may just become a development scene that is convenient for us, but
it's mixed, right? If we see Red Hat OSP, that was always number, right? When we were named. So
Yeah.
it's always going to be mismatch because it's their thing and whatever they prefer.
Yeah, the other thing, like people coming into the community right now for the first time, they don't have the like strong innate feeling that Folsom was really a long time ago, you know, and so it's confusing to people. Like once you've wrapped around, I feel like you really lose a lot of the ordering benefit for new people, you know, like it's all ingrained in me, but it's not for everybody else.
One thing that we could improve is aligning on what we do call that release version in our reference proposals. We call it a release identification code, and thanks, Brian, for pointing that out. And we've sort of been using all kinds of terminologies for the year plus count of the release, from calling it release name to calling it release number to calling it version. And as a bare minimum, we can at least align on what that thing is.
Yeah, like we can have this consistent, means I'm not against calling it release version or number, but anything is okay. But yeah, consistency is okay.
So, right. Anything else on the topic? Guess not. So the next topic is recurring task check and specifically bare recheck state. The Slavic is not here. He usually would provide an Etherpad with updates on that. We can ping him after the meeting or tomorrow if necessary, but we haven't really reached this point of the meeting in a while. So
I
EA
actually have a meta question about that, if someone doesn't mind. In my duties as PTL of Ironic, I noticed we had a couple of contributors doing bear rechecks. I went and asked them, please do some digging, put like a reason there so that we know you're not just, spamming F5. And I've sort of gotten pushback in the past where people have asked me, like, do we do anything with that text, right? Like, is it merely just a sign that someone has done more than just, oh, it failed, maybe it'll pass if I try again? Or do we aggregate those in some way to like look for commonalities? Like, I know we don't do elastic recheck anymore, but that's sort of where I'm thinking. Like, is that text put anywhere or done anything with, or is it literally just symbolic that the person did the needful to, inspect the job?
Symbolic, I think, at this point.
Yeah, a long time ago, there was a tool that would collect them to provide feedback to people like, hey, maybe this is an issue. But then like this was back when Sean was around, and he basically found that the data was inaccurate most of the time. And that's what ultimately led to elastic recheck. And the tool hasn't been running for like a decade, well, 8 years or something, that collected that information.
Okay,
I think
that's what I thought the answer was, but I wanted to make sure before I gave someone that answer that it was correct.
I guess
that's not going to be a satisfying answer for a lot of people, even though I appreciate it.
Well, I mean, symbolic might also be the wrong word, because like I've certainly taken it directly myself when I see that kind of stuff to like kind of, shame is the wrong word, but like nudge somebody. Is like, so what made you want to recheck that? Oh, it failed. Yeah, not good reason. Like, you should go check on that, like coaching opportunities. So even though it's like symbolic, if for those of us that follow the stream on a particular project, it can help to identify some coaching opportunities.
Yeah, I am aligned with you in terms of how you're thinking about it. I might have just picked a bad word to reflect it.
Well, I'm not saying you did. I'm just saying, like, symbolic also sometimes implies that it's not worth anything, and I think it's worth it. But
I mean, even when yourself doing some rechecks and jobs fail intermittently, I mean, in some time you really start noticing that, well, it's intermittent in specific places. So you can really check and validate this. And if someone else from the team or like PTL or core reviewer will go through and issue another recheck with my spot that, well, I see this reason quite a lot lately. So maybe we should do something. And I guess that's the main, reason why we're doing this.
yeah, I mean, I definitely have gone through and looked at them to see, the number of times that someone says recheck and then volume, cinder, or image in the Nova tests is pretty high, right? And that helps to, not script the analysis necessarily, but develop a gut feeling that a lot of people are rechecking because of a test with volume in the name.
Or increasing desperation. Recheck, please pass this time. I need this code to land, please.
I definitely get cute with my recheck things at times. So yeah.
Right. The last thing that I do want to mention before we close the meeting is that there are some governance PRs that I would like you to review. There's a PR to propose a new OpenStack project from James Sunbeam that has not received a lot of discussion yet from the TC members, besides
Very, very
one or two of them.
to get other opinions from other
yes.
folks in the TC about that, because I've commented
So-
in there. I'm very
yeah.
much on the fence, and I want other opinions on that too.
As James is not here, I would not like the discussion to happen here, but please do review the PR and do provide your feedback there.
I will not review it until you stop calling it a PR.
It's
What is the right word for it?
Garrett
Every
review, you can call it leopard if you want, but PR is highly offensive to me, and I will not allow it to
all
happen.
It's a
right.
change. It's a change. according to
Change,
Garrett.
change set, patch. Yeah, I don't. We can call it whatever you want other than PR.
You are right. I have spent entirely too much time in meetings for my actual job in the past week where I've had to say PR repeatedly. So it really ingrained in there. But please review the changes to governance. In specific, Sunbeam, there's one to align release terminology in distros, and there's also a slight documentation change that like changes, or rather aligns better what we call release name, version, and things like that.
I think the main, yeah. Anyway, I will comment.
So yeah, that's all. Thanks all for joining. Have a wonderful rest of the week.
Yeah, thanks, Christy. Thanks everyone.
Bye bye.